The catwalk shook with a low, metallic tremor that was not a single noise but a braided rope of many. Rivet guns barked like metronomes somewhere below. Sling chains rasped. A floor manager's whistle cut through and then disappeared, replaced by the steady, patient roll of fixtures that did not rush and did not stall. From up here the floor seemed to breathe. Aluminum bays inhaled subassemblies and exhaled something that looked more like an airplane each time it passed a station. Men and women in coveralls moved in practiced arcs, sleeves rolled, hair tied up under scarves, goggles squaring their faces into a kind of shared seriousness. The air smelled of oil, cutting fluid, and the scorched sweetness of freshly drilled metal. A clock hammered out seconds on the far wall, far too small to command everyone, and yet impossible to ignore. It said nothing about airplanes. It only said now, and now again. Two visitors paused on the catwalk, careful not to press too hard against the rail. They had been warned not to draw attention, warned to keep their notebooks tucked away unless the path ahead was clear. But the scene pulled at them, as if the building itself had leaned their spines forward. One of them mouthed a number, and then checked it against his watch. He had prepared for anything, he told himself. He knew factories. He could draw from memory the profiles of milling machines and the throat of a press. He had rehearsed skepticism the entire train ride. Show me, prove it. I will not be impressed by slogans. And yet here the slogans did not speak. The cadence did. Stations were balanced, so that one person's completion became another's starting gun without a word exchanged. Dollies slid into place at the exact angle required for two workers to lift apart as if it had chosen to meet them. Colour bands on the floor called out the next position long before anyone had to think about it. Bins were not full of random hardware. Each held a small universe of bolts and nuts already measured into the hours ahead. There was no wave of frantic motion followed by a yawn of waiting. There was only the line. He tried to treat it as a trick. Perhaps the managers had cleaned the chaos just for this visit. Perhaps this was the single tidy corner. He searched for clutter, the betraying pile of cast-offs. He found instead a table of gauges set out like medical instruments, each with a small tag that made them part of a ritual. When a subassembly reached that table, a worker did not guess. They measured and signed off, and the part moved on. The visitor marked the time on his watch again. He did not want to be trapped by wonder, but wonder insisted, narrowing the walls and expanding the floor until there was only the rhythm. Below him, a barrel section slid forward on rollers that barely seemed to move. Then it stopped. Then a team swarmed it with a politeness learned from repetition. And then, with a little push that looked almost playful, it proceeded on. He found the foreman by accident, not because he knew what a foreman looked like, but because there was someone here who spoke the language of the building fluently. The foreman did not give a speech. He pointed with two fingers at the parts the visitors had missed and rattled off the distance between stations in a way that made it obvious that distance was not in feet but in seconds. He mentioned the headache they'd cured when they shortened the air hose by a yard, so the worker no longer had to loop it once around his boot. He grinned about the time they thought a drill press had gone bad, and then realized the jig was asking for a contortion. No wrist could repeat 100 times without wandering. The solution had been plain when they drew it on the floor with chalk. Not genius, the foreman said with a shrug. Just the right order. The visitor began counting. He timed how long it took for a raw frame to arrive at a station. He timed the dance of 4 hands and a tool. He timed the frame to the tool, pause, the wipe of a rag, the nod between partners who didn't need to speak because the line had taught them each other. Then he looked down the mile of the building. He could not see the end because the air was a little smoky and the roofline curled in a way that tricked the eye into believing there was always one more station waiting. But he could see, like a string of beads, the same routine repeating, each station a promise to the next. No part of the process shouted. The dramatic transformation, the moment when the mind declared, "That is a bomber," seemed to refuse drama. It arrived as a steady accretion of correctness. He had been told a sentence in the city the night before, a sentence that sounded like bragging. 1 an hour. He had mocked it privately, intending to discover the quiet footnote that would make it disappear. And yet the floor below suggested that the sentence had been designed as a layman's handle for something far more complex. The line did not build a complete airplane every hour the way a magician produces a dove. The line made sure that every hour mattered. It pushed at the ceiling of what could be done with human hands and simple machines by making the hands and machines forget they were separate. A station finished its work so faithfully that the next station could begin without clearing brush. The visitor did not need to trust the sentence anymore. He only had to acknowledge the arithmetic of motion. Workers moved from station to station at breaks, but the flow did not trust any single hero. It trusted repeatability. When a woman in a polka-dot scarf tightened a row of fasteners, the torque wrench clicked not as applause but as a metronome declaring that the note had been played true. A man in a leather apron inspected a seam with a practiced frown, then adjusted his shoulders and tried again. Not because someone barked at him, but because the seam would travel to a neighbor, and no one wanted to hand a neighbor a rotten apple. The neighbor would hand it to someone else, and eventually it would roll out into daylight on wheels tall enough to shadow a man. The visitors felt the weight of that future and kept counting. They watched a small crisis spool out and resolve in less than a minute. A crate of hardware had arrived with a wrong label. A woman at the kitting table lifted a handful, realized the thread didn't match, and lifted a sign that hung by a cord. The foreman appeared. He did not shout. He opened the second crate in the stack, found the right pieces, and swapped the tags. The kitting table marked 2 lines on a sheet, one for the wrong parts, one for the corrected ones, then waved the next dolly in. The line did not collapse or even stutter. It absorbed the error the way a healthy person absorbs a stumble on a sidewalk. That resilience was the true message. It was not perfection that scared the visitors, but the way imperfection was anticipated and neutralized. At the far end, through the haze, the visitor could make out the silhouette of a tail. It lifted something in him that he did not expect, a childhood thrill of seeing a machine too large to be possible take on a shape. He thought suddenly, unprofessionally, of the men who would sit at those controls, of the engine heat at their knees, of the stretch of ocean under them, and the small clocks on their dashboards that also said now, and now again. He folded his notebook. He had enough numbers to make a report. He had enough details to pretend that he had out-observed the hosts. But what he carried could not be reduced to a row of figures. It was a sensation, the conviction that a system had been taught to produce speed without panic, that people had learned to trust the hour as something they could hold in their hands and shape. He looked at the other visitor, who had been quiet the entire time, and realized they shared a new, disloyal thought. In their training, they had learned to prize the virtuoso workshop, the one-off triumph of a gifted crew tuning an engine until it sang. Here the music came from a different instrument. It came from a building that mapped its own intelligence onto the floor, from a choreography that cheapened nothing by making it available to many. He imagined trying to explain that sensation in a cable home. He imagined how the words would flatten and how the meaning would still leak through, impossible to miss. He imagined a colleague reading the cable and refusing to believe it, and then he imagined that colleague standing on this same catwalk with the same smell of cut aluminum in his lungs, and how quickly disbelief would crumble when the next station accepted another piece, and the clock said now again. On the way down from the catwalk, the stairs rang like a bell. A worker slipped by them with a clipboard and a pencil behind his ear, whistling a tune that had to fight to be heard. A sign near the stairwell listed shift change times, and the visitor read those numbers and understood at last that the sentence he had mocked was only a headline, that the body text was here on the floor, in the people who hit those times and then did it again. He touched the notebook in his pocket as if to make sure it was still there. The pencil felt heavier than it had in the morning. When they reached the concrete, a tug pulled a gleaming subassembly past them, and the visitor stepped aside without thinking, aligning himself to the current. He felt, with a clarity that bordered on treason, that what he had seen could move mountains because it ignored mountains and moved minutes instead. He turned once more at the door. The tail at the far end had not grown, not exactly, and yet it looked fuller, as if his eye, trained by a few circuits through the logic of the place, now recognized its intermediate states as necessary, not awkward. He let the door swing back. The afternoon light on the apron outside showed a finished airplane, crews busy around it with hoses and ladders, people who would never meet the women at the kitting tables, and yet depended on them more than they would ever know. He nodded to no one, then walked into the brightness, unsure whether to feel relief or dread at the realization forming inside him. A nation that could teach this many hands to keep time could decide a war without firing a shot in his direction. It was not the power of a single machine that unsettled him. It was the power of the hour. The map puts a small dot west of Detroit and calls it Ypsilanti, but the dot cannot express the size of the building that grew there when a car company decided to treat airplanes like a problem of flow. The field at Willow Run began as a place with more mud than history. Surveyors cut clean lines across that mud, marked elevations, and then a wave of concrete claimed the ground. The building that rose was low and stubborn, a horizontal monument to the belief that speed does not always come from height. People called it a mile long because that was easier to grasp than square footage, but length was only the simplest dimension. The interior stretched like a grammar lesson, subject to verb to object, raw metal to shaped form to joined assembly, each phrase resolving into the next without stumbling. The product selected for this experiment in scale was the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber conceived elsewhere and brought here for a different destiny. At other plants, Liberators were assembled by crews who treated each airplane like a story with its own quirky characters. At Willow Run, the airplane became a sentence they intended to write without typos, over and over, faster each time, yet no less legible. The partnership that allowed this translation was practical and occasionally tense. The company that knew how to make cars insisted on disciplines that professional aircraft builders had often regarded as too crude for something that had to fly. The people who had flown and fixed earlier Liberators reminded the car people that an airplane is not a chassis with wings, and that a tolerance that looks clean on paper becomes a screaming problem at altitude. The building learned both languages. It produced jigs that forced correctness without bruising the material. It introduced stations that made it impossible for a human wrist to invent a new angle at 3 in the morning. The result was not a car wearing an airplane costume. It was an airplane taught to accept the grace of repetition. Inside the building, the bedrock idea was moving assembly. But moving is too plain a word if it makes you picture a conveyor dragging a reluctant object through a gauntlet. Here, the fixtures moved like tutors guiding a student. They cradled a fuselage barrel and offered it to the next team, not as a problem, but as a question with 3 known steps. They accepted a wing spar and fed it to a rivet crew, who did not have to clamber into an awkward crouch to reach a hole because the fixture had rotated the spar to the position that made the work human. The building did not ask workers to become heroes to compensate for a clumsy process. It defended them from clumsiness so they could become fast. A visitor trying to capture the place in a phrase might point to scale first. It is easy to be dazzled by the vast roof trusses and the river of parts flowing beneath. But scale without discipline is only a circus. The discipline lived in 1,000 small choices. A cart arrived with parts sorted not just by type, but by the order they would be needed in the next 45 minutes. A torque wrench hung from a retractable line so it could not crash to the floor and lose its calibration. Work instructions were not encyclopedias gathering dust on a desk. They were clipped to the fixtures at eye level, written to be understood by a person inhaling aluminum dust and thinking about the time. Around the edges of the main floor, smaller rooms provided specialized care. Heat treatment did not pretend to be heroic, it just hit its numbers. Inspection did not perform suspicion, it performed confidence by catching mistakes where they could still be erased. In each of these choices, the building confessed what it wanted to be. It wanted to be a factory that kept its own promises. The human element did not vanish beneath the weight of the system. You could see it in the break rooms where badges gathered on jackets like tiny banners. You could see it in the way a line lead and a new hire stood shoulder to shoulder during the first week. The lead letting the silence between tasks teach what the hands would have to learn anyway. You could see it in the way women who had never touched a bucking bar were given an afternoon of ruined practice plates and told to ruin them thoroughly until the ruined pieces started to look uncannily consistent. The building made space for rituals that turned strangers into partners, the passing of a pencil stub for tallying cycle times, the little nod when a bench learned how to stage its bins, so a worker did not have to turn her back even once. What it produced, on paper, was aircraft. What it produced, in truth, was throughput. The airplane was the fortunate beneficiary. Throughput meant that the next one could be better than the last because the improvement had a place to stand. A fixture could be redesigned on a Thursday, and the benefits of that exact change could appear in a Friday shift metric. A supplier hiccup could be absorbed without cascading catastrophe because the schedule carried buffers and the planners carried maps of what could be resequenced without wasting human effort. In older shops, the problem of the day became the story of the day, and people went home with sore backs and a new anecdote. At Willow Run, the problem of the day became an entry in a ledger that would be addressed in a way that the building could repeat. That ledger looked dull to an outsider. It looked like power to anyone who had ever tried to make more of something, complicated. The airplane itself did not get easier just because it agreed to flow. The B-24 was a dense machine stuffed with systems that had to respect each other. Fuel lines could not quarrel with control cables. Engines wanted to drink a steady diet of clean air, and the nacelles had to invite that air in without creating the kind of drag that turned a four-engine bomber into a sulking giant. The factory could not wish away that complexity. It could only stage it. That staging is what made the building famous. If you watched long enough, you saw where the gods of aviation continued to hide. In the way a piece of skin protested when a rivet hole wandered by half a hair, in the way a crew cursed a misaligned template that had not been caught upstream, in the way a wing section demanded space and alone time before it agreed to mate with a fuselage. Those gods still had to be appeased, but the offerings were precise and scheduled. The building taught reverence and impatience at the same time. Willow Run was also a community. Buses groaned out of neighborhoods that had not sent many people to airplane plants before. Men who had built dashboards and women who had sewn seat covers learned the weight of a bomber's rib when 6 of them lifted it and set it down in a single smooth count. There were arguments about cadence and about what good enough could mean when the part you were touching would sit under a crew crossing a sea in winter. The arguments were not philosophical because philosophy would have wasted time. They were specific. They produced marks on floor tape and pencil notes on drawings and a morning change in the way a bin was filled. The community began to measure itself not in pride alone, but in numbers that felt like pride. A shift met a target and wrote the target on a chalkboard with a small underline, as if underlining made it more real. From the outside, the plant looked like a wager that the country had thrown on the table, a declaration that quantity could be a kind of virtue. From the inside, it looked like a school that refused to let anyone stay in the first term. People learned. The building learned. The airplane learned to be built this way. By the time the reputation had spread beyond the county and turned into headlines, the floor had already made peace with the idea that fame had no cycle time and would not help hit the next hour. It would fade. The work would remain. That is what Willow Run actually was. A practical engine for turning intention into schedule, schedule into motion, and motion into an artifact that could leave the ground and carry with it all the decisions that made it possible. Before the building had a name that newspapers would recognize, the country had a problem that was both simple and terrifying. The world was arming itself faster than old methods could respect. In 1940, the pace of preparation quickened, and a set of conversations that once belonged to committees took on a different tone. Schedules became weapons. Men in offices drew lines on calendars that did not trust the future to be patient. Those lines crossed state borders and company boundaries and the quiet habits of entire trades. What begins here, the lines said, must finish there, and it must do so soon enough to matter. That is why a car company known for turning out millions of near-identical machines agreed to court an airplane that had earned its pride in a culture that prized one-off victories. The early meetings were awkward. People arrived with thick binders and strangers' politeness. Some spoke grandly about capacity, as if capacity were a dragon they could summon. Others frowned and asked who would heat-treat the parts when winter came. The awkwardness did not last long because the ground crews at airfields needed machines, not poetry, and because the calendar did not intend to slow down. The agreement was struck, and in 1941 surveyors found themselves stamping their boots in a damp field and telling each other that the puddles would be gone in a month. The first months were a kind of theatre in which all the props were late. The ground swallowed trucks up to their axles. The steel for the roof arrived with a sigh of relief that would have been a cheer if the wind had not carried it away. Men welded in weather that stung their fingers. The optimists said the distance to the first airplane could be spanned like a creek. The pessimists said the creek was a river and would rise with spring melt. It is easy, in hindsight, to reduce those months to a sentence about construction. But in the moment, there were days when the line on the calendar looked like a lie. What held the line to the page was a habit of untangling problems before they hardened. Someone showed up with a tractor when a truck bogged down. Someone rewrote a delivery schedule to borrow slack from a future week. These were not glories. They were the stitches that stopped the wound from widening. By 1942, the interior began to look less like an echoing barn and more like a plan that had found its body. Fixtures arrived and stood like sculptures made by people who only loved use. A small orchestra of test stands set up along one wall, their dials sitting with the composure of judges. The first assemblies flowed, hesitantly at first, then with a small swagger. The building was still learning the airplane, and the airplane was not always gracious about being learned. Places that had seemed simple on a drawing revealed their mischief when metal met metal at speed. The line slowed to let a toolmaker scold a template, then resumed with a tiny adjustment that shortened the move of an elbow by a finger's width. Each such correction saved nothing in a single minute. It saved hours when you multiplied it by the length of the day. In 1943, the numbers on the chalkboards stopped looking like wishful thinking. The people on the floor could feel the difference because they no longer braced for the daily catastrophe that had once been a guest with a standing invitation. The building's heart rate steadied. The idea of rate, as something owned and not borrowed, entered conversations not as a dare but as a premise. Men who had once questioned whether a bomber could be taught to act like a car part began to accept that the lesson had taken. This acceptance did not make them careless, it made them ambitious. Once a person trusts that their effort will not be swallowed by chaos, they bring new ideas to the bench. The benches listened. Space was carved out of aisles to let a bin sit at a more sensible angle. A system appeared to replenish small fasteners before a worker had to notice they were low. Managers learned to apologize to the line when they asked for experiments that caused stumbles. The line forgave them if the experiments brought speed next week. In 1944, the phrase that newspapers loved began to make a certain kind of sense. At peak cadence, the plant could present to the world an airplane at intervals that made the clock itself feel like a partner. People argued in good faith about whether 1 per hour captured the truth or merely polished it. The truth, as the floor understood it, was that hours do not yield equally. Some hours sit atop weeks of preparation, others are light work after a heavy morning. But for stretches, glorious stretches that workers on later shifts would talk about for years, the math held at a scale no skeptic could sneer away. An airplane rolled toward daylight with the inevitability of a train. Another followed and another, and when the count was tallied it matched the intention with a precision that produces its own peculiar joy. The world outside, of course, refused to arrange itself in deference to anyone's schedule. War requires more than metal. It requires fuel and crews and airfields that have runways long enough to tolerate a heavy load and cold mornings. For every airplane that glowed under the shop lights, there were 40 questions, waiting out past the apron. Where would this one go? How many hours of flight test would it demand before a crew could trust it? What would a depot in a different climate say about a quirk discovered after a week of hard use? The line had answers to the only questions it could own. The rest belonged to a network of places that were learning their own versions of rate and reliability. To tell the story of Willow Run without that network would be to tell a story about a heart that forgot it had arteries and veins. By 1945, the calendar began to speak in a voice that the building had not heard before. It began to schedule endings. The space that had been so fiercely claimed from mud and skepticism began to open itself to other futures. The line did not shed its knowledge when it slowed. Nothing as thick as this disappears when the clock changes its mind. The fixtures held their shape. The people carried what they had learned into other rooms, other towns, other trades. The date on the last page of a project plan does not erase the ink on the first pages. It only asks it to explain itself one last time. When crews walked the floor at the end of that year, they could see the ghosts of the day in 1942, when the first assemblies learned to behave, and the day in 1943 when the chalkboard numbers became trustworthy, and the day in 1944 when the headline version of the truth could finally stand up straight. If you retell this as 5 neat bullet points, you insult the work. Each milestone was not a sign on a highway, but a town where people lived for a while. Early chaos was a real place with its own weather. The first reliable flow was a place with a day shift and a night shift, and a diner that figured out how to serve both. Peak cadence was a place with a hum in its sidewalks, a hum you could feel through your shoes if you stood still. The wind down was not a funeral. It was a graduation. The building had done what it set out to do. It had proved that a sentence about hours could be more than the boast of a politician. It could be a description of a community that learned to put one motion after another with such faithfulness that distance became time, and time became output, and output became something that could cross an ocean and come back again as the rumor of survival. When you walk those dates now, you feel each underfoot. You feel the skip in 1941 when a truck bogs down and a foreman invents a solution on the spot. You feel the stride in 1943 when the day's run matches yesterday's and the line knows it can match tomorrow's. You feel the sprint in 1944 when daylight greets the nose of another machine and crews on the tarmac look up from their ladders with a little grin, as if greeting an old friend who keeps arriving exactly on time. And you feel the slowing in 1945, not as defeat, but as a long breath after a race run cleanly, a breath that says the knowledge will not go to sleep just because a calendar page turned. A building can be reduced to measurements and still refuse to fit inside them. You can say the floor space and the length and the width of the aisles. You can list the number of windows and the horsepower of the compressors. Those numbers are true the way a map is true. They help you find the place. They do not explain why people wanted to stay there. Still, the numbers matter, and a fair telling should give them their due in sentences that remember they are connected to hands. Begin with the sprawl. The plant covered so much ground that a person unfamiliar with factories could stand at one end and feel the same vertigo a traveller feels on a prairie road. The roof seemed to settle the sky by force of insistence. Inside, the line traced a deliberate path that refused tight corners and unnecessary drama. The distance between major stations was not an accident of architecture. It was the length of time needed for a task performed by a trained crew with tools placed in reach. That is a fact, though it wears work, clothes instead of a tuxedo. When someone tells you the building was a mile long, here in that mile the saving of seconds repeated until the savings built an airplane. Consider the product. The B-24 was not an easy child. 4 engines meant 4 headaches when the day was cold and the oil was reluctant. A high-aspect wing that carried the promise of range also carried demands in assembly that punished sloppy fixtures. Systems crowded one another in the fuselage so tightly that a mistake in routing did not merely inconvenience the next crew. It prevented flight. To turn such a machine into something that could be coaxed down a line was to persuade complexity to sit still long enough to be understood. If you want a number, consider the count of distinct parts and the portion sourced from beyond the walls. Each part brought its own schedule. Each schedule wanted to slide out of alignment with the lines. The feat was not to memorize the counts. The feat was to make the counts irrelevant by building a replenishment habit that did not panic at every hiccup. Labor is a number too, and a moving one. At peak, the head count swelled until parking lots became maps of how far people were willing to travel for a shift that started before dawn or ended when a child needed breakfast. The percentage of women in those numbers rose because a nation had asked its definitions to widen. The training hours required to turn a person who had never touched a pneumatic tool into someone who could feel a bad rivet through gloves were not a guess. They were measured. They produced pride when a trainee graduated to a station where the cycle time left less room for fumbles. If you need a fact to pin to that pride, pin the reduction in rework after a month at rate. The decline was not magic. It was the species learning in public. There were other figures that people liked to recite because they felt like proof. Peak daily output, the flattering ratios that turned weekly totals into per hour, equivalents, the count of flight test crews ramping nearby to drink the river the factory poured. The caution to attach to such figures is not meant to dull their shine, it is meant to give them weight. A per-hour claim means little if it ignores shift structure, and the reality that inspection and test stand outside the door and take their own honest time. A daily total means more when it is paired with the number of first-pass acceptances. A monthly total means most when someone can show how many of those machines were fielded where and how quickly. These are not the coy quibbles of pedants. They are the inner wiring of what people on the floor tried to achieve. They wanted not just to make airplanes. They wanted to make usable airplanes at a pace that did not betray the crews who would fly them. Suppliers supply facts, too. Engines and turrets did not assemble themselves in the corner. They arrived with histories and constraints. A late batch of engines could not be willed into existence by a foreman's charm. A shortage of a certain alloy could ripple through the plan the way a single cough ripples through a choir. The buffers that insulated the line from those ripples were measured in days of inventory and in contingency plans as specific as which stations could switch to a different order of operations without wasting effort. If you want to know whether a factory understands itself, do not ask how many crates it opened yesterday. Ask which crates it can afford not to open today and still meet tomorrow's promise. The building's systems for caring for its own correctness were facts without vanity. Gauges lined up overnight to be checked against standards. Torque tools met their masters on schedules that did not bend just because mornings were busy. Document control made sure that a change promised by an engineer found the bench where it needed to land and not the rumour mill. A visitor could tour these systems and be bored. The boredom would be a compliment. The people running them did not want applause. They wanted to sleep at night, knowing that a wrench had not drifted out of truth in the third week of hard use. Even the aprons care about facts. Break schedules were not invented to coddle. They were tuned so hands would still be steady in the last hour of a shift. Lighting levels were not an aesthetic choice. They were a reading of what eyes can endure. Noise controls did not fussily seek silence. They sought audibility for the human voice that had to call out a warning or a piece of knowledge that could not wait until the end of a run. When the war asked for more and then more again, these small domestic facts protected the line from the kind of hurry that turns speed into waste. And then there is the headline number, the one that will live on in coffee table books. 1 per hour is easy to say and hard to earn. At stretches of peak cadence, when the upstream was well watered and flight test could drink what the line poured, the building met an interval that dignified the sentence. The reason the sentence deserves respect is not that it describes a permanent law of the place. It deserves respect because it describes an intention realized often enough under hard conditions to teach a nation that time can be a material. That lesson is the largest fact of all. It does not fit in a tidy box because it keeps flowing outward. It lives in the way a woman who once learned to buck rivets at rate later organizes a kitchen like a tiny factory and teaches her children to set the table with the efficiency of a line. It lives in the way a man who learned to stage bins so that no hand has to turn twice later becomes a supervisor at a smaller plant and refuses to let chaos dress itself in romance. So yes, gather the sizes and the rates and the counts and the schedules and the percentages. Speak them aloud. They are beautiful in their way. Then step back and let them join the sound of the floor, the gentle, relentless persuasion of motion done right. The facts are not decorations added after the work. They are the work learning to explain itself. The first breakthrough was not thunderous. It sounded like a latch closing with the exact pressure needed to hold a shape still. Fixtures did the teaching. A wing spar settled into a cradle that rotated on command, so a worker faced each hole squarely rather than fighting a bad angle. Barrel sections rested in saddles that indexed forward with neat little clicks, each stop a promise that the next station would meet its match without sighing. The aim was not to turn people into machines, but to make the machine-like parts of the job gentle on people. When the geometry protected wrists and shoulders, accuracy arrived as a side effect, and with accuracy came tempo. Tempo needs a clock, but not a tyrant's clock. The floor measured the day in small, repeating spans that crews could feel in their backs and hands. Balance sheets lived behind clipboards as living guesses that the line corrected minute by minute. When a step ran long because a cable fought through a tight bend or a fastener flirted before seating, the fix rarely demanded heroics. A bin moved 6 inches. A hose gained a swivel. A paper template that smudged after lunch became a metal one that told the truth at dusk. Seconds shaved from one motion braided into minutes that the shift felt only at the end, like a pleasant surprise waiting at the time clock. Kitting was the conscience. In older shops, work began with a hunt. Here the hunt was finished before a piece ever reached the bench. Packets contained the next hour arranged in the order the hands would need it. The rare bracket flagged, so it would not dress up as its ordinary cousin. This was not pampering. It was respect for attention as a finite resource. When a crate arrived mislabeled, the world was corrected and the lie recorded, not for blame but to keep tomorrow innocent. The quiet rooms where kitting happened felt like libraries. They were the places where the line's future stayed tidy. Signals made calm visible. A chord invited a pause before an error could reproduce. A small light asked for help without public drama. The board above the aisle, chalked in a steady hand, did not threaten. It simply told the day's story so that a stumble could be answered while it was still a wobble. The rule was simple and fierce. Do not shove a doubt downstream and call that progress. A bench was allowed to breathe for a beat, if breathing prevented a cough that would sicken the next 4 hours. Design learned its manners. In early weeks, drawings cherished graceful arcs and left fitters to invent body angles a spine could not keep repeating. The plant, deaf to romance, brought curves and holes into relationships with jigs that refused improvisation. Edges gained chamfers to welcome blind approaches. Hole patterns accepted the logic of hardened drill plates that did not suffer from end-of-shift fatigue. Intelligence moved from wrists to fixtures, less glamour, better results. The machine did not get simpler, it became teachable at scale. There was still stubbornness. Certain skins, coaxed around tight radii, acted like divas and demanded patience. A bracket insisted on teaching humility to new hands every Monday. The answer was not to scold matter but to stage it. Teams padded the hour where a task bit, stealing that padding back when the job went sweet. Slack migrated across minutes the way a good foreman moves along an aisle quietly, always arriving before worry crystallizes. To a visitor, nothing looked dramatic. Motions were simple enough to explain to a teenager. That was the trick. Actions were made so comprehensible that fresh hires could enter the dance without tripping the partners. Benches kept their catechism. This, then that. This pressure, not more. This angle, the one the jig permits. A veteran rotating out for a day did not cause mourning. The bench tutored the next pair with the same sentences and discovered that continuity is a form of speed. By late afternoons, the place felt like a river that had found its bedrock. Trials were staged during gentler hours. Their gains were harvested during hard ones. When a change worked, its signature appeared in station time rather than in speeches. When it failed, failure was noticed early enough to cost a blush, not an airplane. Extremes lost their charm. The sovereign value became a cumulative correctness, a morality of small mercies extended to hands and metal alike. The airframe learned to flow. It accepted being turned like bread browning evenly on all sides. It enjoyed a path with no blind elbows. The schedule above the aisle did not crush. It kept faith with the body's ability to repeat without harm. Respect ran in both directions. The plant honored the machine by refusing sloppiness and honored labor, by forcing every difficult motion to justify its existence. In that narrow space of mutual regard, an airplane stopped being a miracle and became a current that anyone disciplined enough could step into and feel carried forward. Grand intentions are tested where time piles up. Engines did not merely arrive. They arrived carrying other people's calendars. A late week in a distant plant echoed here as a hollow in the schedule. The cure was staging that acted like a reservoir. Install points were chosen with care so a fuselage could keep learning while a heart caught up. Crews rehearsed, resequencing like a fire drill. If a nacelle lacked a promised assembly, neighboring tasks stepped forward without leaving a mess for Thursday to trip over. Turrets were lessons in compressed complexity. Optics met electrics in cramped housings that disliked big hands and blunt moods. A turret that tracked sweetly on a northern bench could sulk after a rough truck ride. The line did not dignify sulk with panic. Dedicated bays absorbed misbehavior. Technicians spoke the dialect of suppliers, and acceptance tests at the door measured behavior rather than promises. The delay stopped being contagious because it had been given a room and a clock. Paperwork could choke quietly. Early routing lived on cards that smudged and wandered, orphaning parts whose only crime was shyness. The fix was visibility. Travelers were clipped to fixtures in bruising colors. Engineering changes stopped arriving as rumors and turned into releases that landed at every bench before lunch. Small symbols carried large meaning. A check, a hold, a repair permitted, a deviation forbidden today but under review for Friday. The conversation narrowed to what the hands needed to know, exactly when they needed to know it. Heat treatment had the power to halt a beautiful day without raising its voice. Loads had to be built intelligently, cycles started on time, and hiccups announced before they bloomed into famine. A back room learned to think like chess players, pairing parts that shared temperatures and dwell times, predicting bottlenecks 2 moves ahead. Predictability outranked charm. The line forgave almost anything if it knew when the forgiveness would be required. Inspection taught humility to heroes and courage to managers. The wrong instinct is always the same. Demand speed at the gate and call the day saved. The right instinct moved gauges upstream, seeded first-piece rituals at the benches, and shrank the final bottleneck until it was a doorway rather than a canyon. A flaw discovered late became an oddity. A flaw prevented early became a habit. When inspection overreached and fussed at non-problems, the flaw sure of its virtue pushed back without sulking. Aim improved. Bullets stopped striking air. Material rationing made scarcity into a daily arithmetic. No speech could conjure alloy that did not exist. Planners learned to trade days without leaving tomorrow malnourished. Substitutions were mapped like recipes, not excuses. The line learned where cousins could stand in without blasphemy and where a sacrament must be honored. Ingenuity ceased to be a last-second scream and became a schedule printed in small type along the edge of every week. Administrative friction wore kind faces. Meetings convened in the name of coordination and stole leaders from aisles that needed a nod more than a memo. The place cut itself lean. Stand-ups were conducted at the bench with a pencil tapping apart. Long councils landed where the appetite was lowest. Visitors were welcomed without turning the day into theatre. Attention, discovered to be more precious than money, was spent where aluminum met tool steel. Each bottleneck delivered the same lesson in a different dialect. An hour is braided seconds. Cure a 5-minute irritant, a kinked hose, a crate that resists opening, a template that skates on lacquer, and you do not save 5 minutes once. You save it every time the hour passes this corner. By evening, a room can feel the compound interest through its boots. Engines will still be late, turrets still moody, paper still human. But the building greets each with a rehearsed politeness that shrinks catastrophe into work. The hour belongs to those who plan for its enemies and seat them in the corner with a warm cup and a short appointment. People arrived by bus and rumour and need. Some had set points on distributors, some had threaded needles, some had learned the choreography of a diner at lunch rush. The building met them with coffee, oil, and paper. then asked them to trade improvisation for rhythm. Tools were introduced like characters in a play. A rivet gun revealed its weight and, with coaching, its willingness to do the heavy part of the work. A bucking bar hummed when truth had been told to metal and complained when a lie had slipped in. Scrap plates forgave early errors until errors became boring, which is how repetition says, "Now you are ready." Mentors arranged bodies rather than giving lectures. A thumb moved half an inch and a foot slid left. A task that had looked stubborn became light. Stories were short and anatomical. Do not fight the hose, make the jig answer you. Leave a station tidy enough that the next person silently blesses your name. Authority felt like competence extended toward a neighbor. Skill ladders were visible only in hindsight. A person started at a gentle bench, graduated to operations that echoed downstream, and finally carried a kind of quiet power, the right to teach without raising a voice. Life outside the walls had to be engineered if hands inside were to stay steady. The plant negotiated bus routes, offered a place for lunches that did not vanish, structured breaks as obligations rather than treats. Fatigue was hunted in ordinary places. Anti-fatigue mats that looked like small luxuries proved to be cheap insurance. Rotation schedules shared the wear across muscles. Relief crews stepped in without anyone needing to dramatize a struggle. The line learned to admit biology and grew faster because it stopped pretending. Voices braided into a common music. The room contained country vowels, city speed, jokes told in 3 different rhythms, lullabies hummed before dawn. Standards made space for difference without tolerating cruelty. Harassment was treated as theft of time and pushed out with the same resolve used on bad fixtures. Pride appeared slowly, then suddenly, everywhere. It was the kind that wipes a smudge no customer will see and says good job without making eye contact because the next motion is already due. When a new machine rolled into daylight, the warmth that moved along the aisles felt earned, not sprayed. Knowledge needed highways. Station notebooks evolved from scoldings into maps. The best entries were sketches of angles that tamed old mischiefs, notes that a certain pallet number lied about what it carried, whispers that inspection had tightened on micro cracks and would stay that way until Friday. These roadside hints turned a building into a school where each class left chalk for the next. A competent teacher was the person who could slow a motion by an inch to speed a shift by an hour. The miracle, such as it was, had nothing to do with prophecy. It was the discovery that expertise equals keeping time together. Stars were admired, but the ensemble earned the paycheck. The best workers were those who made the next person's minute easier every single time, who could hold the beat when the music in their own head skipped, who passed along work that felt friendly to the hands that would inherit it. Strangers became partners because a schedule asked them to be kind at the exact points where kindness saves seconds. In that discipline, the building found a temperament. Calm, quick, and stubbornly fair. Speed lied at first. It posed in totals and hid the caravan of rework that limped through the night. The floor taught speed to bring a witness. Quality with numbers that could not blush. The early embarrassments were specific and fixable. A seam wandered because a jig crept under vibration. A cable bundle pinched beneath a bracket because the routing diagram preferred elegance to physics. A panel fit perfectly on Monday and sulked on Wednesday because skins had drifted thin. Each sin cost minutes the day did not have. The cure was appetite for cause. Patching a symptom once was mercy. Patching it twice was warning. The third time sent someone back upstream with calipers and orders. Fixtures became stricter and kinder at once. Locating pins hardened and learned not to mushroom. Clamps closed with a feel that workers could trust blind. Plates that drifted under sweaty palms gained textures that refused to slide. Calibration days grew teeth. A tired tool makes honest people into liars. Tired tools were retired the way a dull drill is without drama, immediately. First, pass yield moved from the back office to the chalkboard next to throughput. A day that hit rate but sent ghosts to rework did not count as a victory. Acceptance upstream turned inspection into a formality that still mattered, but no longer frightened the schedule. Paper stopped being a museum and started being a machine. Change orders were written for eyes that read while a rivet gun coughed nearby. Drawings shed vanity and kept what hands required. A clean view, a short ladder of revisions whose reasons anyone could recite. 3 marks check, hold, repair permitted carried more sense than a paragraph. The revision chatter that ruins lesser places turned here into learning. You could point to a tweak and say who it saved and when. The culture around mistakes inverted. A flaw at inspection no longer felt like a suspect dragged into a chilly room. Inspectors travelled to benches with evidence and tact, carrying the offending part and the neighbour it had bruised. The person who drilled the hole in the wrong mood did not wilt. They shifted the template, felt the new reach, and agreed to retire the old habit. When an inspector chased vanity, the flaw pushed back gently but firmly. Aim improved. Quality stopped wasting bullets. Confidence rose because information flowed without theatre. Suppliers learned the same manners. A lot that lived slightly outside a promise could not be forgiven by charm. Sampling replaced size, charts replaced rumours, reputations were rewritten in the only language factories trust, the next purchase order. Predictable partners enjoyed quiet lives. Dramatic ones learned that drama burns hours. The lesson travelled outward along the supply web until packing slips arrived with fewer surprises and pallets contained what their labels swore they did. The prettiest ritual was small. At the start of a shift, a pair pulled a first piece, ran a tight little liturgy of checks, and signed for the next pair rather than for management. If the piece sang, the hour began on true pitch. If it croaked, no one wasted effort on product that would be revoked by nightfall. The habit was too brief to feel solemn and just serious enough to keep honesty close to the hands. Quantity divorced from truth is theft. The building stopped saying the sentence and started living it. Numbers on the big board learned nuance. A day fell short because a fix rightly ate an hour. The board recorded the shortfall as an investment rather than a sin. Tomorrow often paid with interest. People tasted the rare delight of seeing improvement arrive on time, not as a lucky accident but as consequence. That delight changed how they walked in from the lot shoulders level, expecting the schedule to mean what it said. The temptation to brag did not vanish, but it lost its shine. Visitors asked for miracles. The floor offered arithmetic. In the arithmetic lay the calm that made speed durable. It went fast because it told the truth, and faster still because it knew exactly where to slow. Stories have a way of drifting in from the parking lot and trying to sit at a workbench. The most tenacious one wore a stopwatch around its neck and announced that a gleaming bomber appeared as predictably as the minute hand. People wanted the sentence because it was clean and flattering, a headline you could fit on a postcard. On the floor, the sentence was translated into something humbler and truer. What happened each hour was not a magic birth, but a meeting. A moving procession of assemblies arrived at a final station, already blessed by 100 small fidelities upstream. If an hour ended in daylight and applause, it was because several days had given themselves to that moment without demanding credit. The factory refused to insult itself by pretending a miracle occurred at the door. It honored the miracle distributed everywhere else. Another myth arrived wearing a smirk that said car tricks would never tame an airplane. The people who had grown up among wing spars and turbulence wished to believe that the sky required rituals no earthbound discipline could understand. The cure for that vanity was not contempt but contact. Once jigs held, their line under fatigue and fixtures rotated heavy parts into postures human wrists could repeat. The airframe accepted the same courtesies that had made automobiles swift to assemble. None of this erased the difference between a sedan and a 4-engine machine meant for thin air and hard weather. It simply moved intelligence to the places where scale could preserve it. A fitter's genius, once a fragile treasure guarded by a handful of veterans, was leashed to geometry and spread across crews who had met yesterday on a bus. A more poisonous myth whispered that a single building could claim a war for itself. Pride wants to be solitary. Throughput taught otherwise. Nothing leaving this roof could fly without parts that crossed county lines and state borders, without depots that taught new machines how to behave after their first rough week, without fields carved from farmland where crews learned to trust their instruments. When the plant reached for pace, it felt the web tug back. Engines had their own calendars, turrets their own moods, aluminum its own ration board. The glory here was not independence, but coordination. The admission that the best way to be strong was to pull in time with 1,000 neighbors you would never meet. There was a myth about genius, the kind that loves secrets. Visitors came expecting to be handed one trick, a talisman they could take home and whisper to their own floors at night. The answer they received sounded disappointingly domestic. Parts that wanted to roll were given textures that refused to slip. Templates that smudged at 2 o'clock were remade from material that told the truth at 10. A hose stopped kinking because it learned to lie where the wrist wanted it to. In the ledger, these changes were small. In the rhythm, they were decisive. The room learned to value fixes that would bore a journalist and thrill a foreman. Boredom became a signal of perfection. There was, too, a myth that intelligence services scoffed at what they had not built. Skepticism is a professional habit and usually a healthy one. It dulled when numbers refused to blink. A visitor with a suspicious notebook could time a station and walk 3 turns of the line and discover that the arithmetic downstream matched the arithmetic upstream. A piece that had been promised at 11 arrived at 11 and was not disfigured by excuses. A day written on a board at dawn looked exactly like the same day when the clock swallowed dusk. Doubt can survive one coincidence. It cannot survive a week of punctuality. The most dangerous myth was the one that insisted that speed and honesty are enemies. People who had fled other shops wore that lesson like a scar. They had seen totals that glowed while rework howled in a side room. They expected the same trick here and waited for the moment when someone would ask them to shove a worry into tomorrow. Instead, the plant invited worries to announce themselves, while the cost was still a blush. Quality walked upstream and spoke to benches in a tone that made correction feel like competence. First-piece rituals turned mornings into vows. The door at the far end still mattered, but it had been robbed of its drama by 1,000 small acts of truthfulness that travelled with the work from station to station. In telling and retelling, these myths unravelled. Workers who had arrived suspicious of slogans learned to enjoy sentences that were plain and measurable. A machine rolled toward daylight because time had been braided properly, because fixtures were strict and kind, because parts arrived with their stories attached and no-attached, because hands took pride in being predictable. Reality did not sneer at romance. It replaced romance with something steadier. The floor acquired a personality. It distrusted exaggeration and adored routine. It called things by their right names and saved its joy for the quiet moment when the next hour behaved exactly like the last on purpose. The building did more than disprove illusions. It built a new imagination for what an industrial day could feel like. People came to work expecting to be treated as partners in a long piece of music whose tempo was neither cruel nor loose. They learned a habit of counting that was generous rather than mean. The sentence about the hour, scrubbed of swagger, survived as a promise the room could keep. The reality beneath it, thick with human detail, was larger than the boast it replaced. It was a civilization of metal and chalk and breath, teaching itself how to be calm at speed. Bold numbers breed devotion and mischief in equal measure. To keep the devotion and starve the mischief, the room developed a way of listening. It began with a simple question. What window does this number look through? A cadence can be counted at the tip of the line where finished machines smile for the camera. It can also be counted in the walk from the first jig to the last clamp, where minutes mean more than applause. When acclaim held still under both glances, trust began to grow. Hourly intervals that sounded like thunder at the door had to rhyme with the quiet arithmetic that made them possible at the benches. If the rhyme failed, the number was a costume. The next habit avoided confusing station time with usable time. A crew can conquer its minutes so cleanly that the board above the aisle reports victory before lunch. That triumph is only a down payment. Inspection speaks later, sometimes with a raised eyebrow that turns speed into delay. Test on the apron speaks later still, reminding the building that a machine is a promise kept only when engines, systems, and crews all agree. The cure is not cynicism, it is vocabulary. People learn to keep two ledgers at once, one for flow and one for acceptance, and to celebrate only when they matched. This did not drain joy, it protected it. Claims about rate adore round numbers. They roll off the tongue and stick to memory. The floor taught itself to love crooked decimals where truth tends to live. 1 hour is a unit made for speeches. 56 minutes at one station and 68 at another are units made for improvement. The crooked numbers showed where tools lied when they were tired, where a bin sat 6 inches too far to the left, where a template sung until sweat made it skate. Once you learn to listen to crooked numbers, round ones sound like marching bands playing vaguely the right tune. The line did not banish the band. It simply refused to dance to it. There was also the question of upstream and downstream appetite. A boast that ignores engines arriving in crates and turrets sulking after a long ride is a boast that will thin under the lights. The plant learned to read a claim the way a cook reads a recipe, asking where the ingredients will come from and what happens if the market is lean on Thursdays. Schedules were drawn with small reservoirs that could absorb ordinary weather and a few storms. In those reservoirs, a nuanced truth took shape. Rate is not merely the speed of hands. It is the resilience of a plan when one ingredient arrives late and the stew must still be hearty by supper. A more subtle reading asked who owns the bottleneck today. The answer changed. Some mornings, heat treatment held the baton. On other days, inspection rehearsed longer than anyone liked. Occasionally, the bottleneck wore a human face. A mentor pulled into meetings just when a trainee needed a nudge. Rather than treat this shifting crown as chaos, the plant made a sport of spotting it early. Once spotted, the room refused to moralize. A bottleneck is not a villain, it is a teacher. Rate increases when the right student learns the right lesson from the right bottleneck at the right hour. The factory also disciplined its memory. Stories that begin with once felt good to tell and were dangerous to believe. A day of brilliant pace could not be averaged across a month just because it glowed. A miserable weak engines, delayed, paper wandering, tempers short could not be allowed to define a quarter. The board stopped acting like a diary and became a ledger. Patterns, rather than episodes, earned the authority to set expectations. Work got quieter as a result. Pride stayed, but it stopped shouting. All this listening yielded a practical ritual that began before sunrise. A team pulled a first piece and gave it the attention of a jeweler and a midwife. They measured, tugged, verified, and then made a small decision that would ripple forward, proceed or pause. Proceed meant the day's claims could begin acquiring weight. Pause meant that honesty had earned a little time. The ritual borrowed 5 minutes from the hour and loaned them to the rest of the shift at favorable interest. People who had suffered in places where truth arrived late learned to trust this economy more than any speech about excellence. None of this made the room timid. A schedule that speaks softly can still be brave. The reading taught people where to accelerate without tearing their own muscles. It gave permission to ease a fraction at a station where pride had been hiding a flaw. It taught crews to ask for help before fatigue began to counterfeit accuracy. The result, paradoxically, was pace that looked bolder precisely because it no longer relied on pretense. When the plant finally did accept a bright sentence about itself, the sentence rested on a platform of small, sturdy facts. It could bear weight. It could walk out the door and face weather. In the end, the discipline of reading did not turn the place into a courtroom. It turned it into a school where numbers argued and then graduated. Claims wore plain clothes and did not mind being checked by hands that smelled of oil. If they passed, they joined the architecture of the day, as unremarkable and indispensable as a well-placed hook or a mat that saves ankles. If they failed, they went back to class. This is how a building learns to be immune to hype, while still loving what it is capable of. It writes its promises in chalk, keeps an eraser nearby, and earns the right to ink. A line that looks inevitable from above is, up close, an argument conducted politely and at speed. The voices come from offices that sign allocations and from benches that hold fasteners in gloved hands. Somewhere in the middle, a set of institutions turned urgency into law. Scarce metals received passports stamped by boards that rationed. Advance orders acquired the gravity of contracts between strangers, and factories like this one learned that a week is not a private island. The rules were heavy, and the stakes heavier. Still, the miracle was that decisions moved quickly enough to matter. Inside the walls, authority travelled on the shortest possible roads. A foreman who knew the flavour of a station's problems could convene a decision with a pencil and 2 witnesses. If the fix touched tooling, an engineer arrived not as a censor but as a guardian of geometry, ready to protect the long future of the jig from the short desperation of the hour. If the fix touched suppliers, a buyer stepped into the aisle carrying more than charm. They carried history, the record of which promises had been kept and which had needed rescuing on dark afternoons. Standing above all of them was a calendar that refused to be romantic. It asked one question in many dialects: will this choice pay back by Friday? The flow of paperwork, often cursed as a clog in other places, became here a kind of bloodstream. Changes written in morning ink appeared at benches before lunch because the messengers did not detour into theatre. A release did not celebrate itself with flourish. It declared what changed, why and who should stop doing what for the sake of whom. The language stayed short because long words bend under vibration and fall into coolant trays. When a document needed heft, it earned it by touching 3 or 4 hands that would have to live with its consequences, and by surviving a single question asked with kindness: what would break if we were wrong? Above the roofline, a broader choreography set tempo. Agencies watched over priorities with the kind of attention that, if misused, becomes vanity, and if properly used, becomes fairness. They weighed engines against landing gear, food against fasteners, rubber against the demands of winter. The plant learned to speak to these arbiters without begging or bluster. It brought numbers instead of adjectives. It explained not only what a shortage would do to its own board, but what that delay would cost in the network downstream. A strange intimacy grew between people who would never meet. A clerk allocating alloy in a distant office, and a worker trying not to waste a drill bit on a Friday afternoon. Decisions also flowed laterally, across the human grid that carries gossip and correction. A lead from night shift left a sketch and a sentence for the morning, not as an order but as a favour, and favours earned interest. A trouble ticket filed politely yielded a visit that fixed not only the complaint but the next 3 it would have begotten. The modesty of these exchanges could fool an outsider. They were not small. They were the way indifference is kept out of rooms where it likes to breed. The habit of treating attention as currency spread until the building felt less like a hierarchy and more like a market where good ideas bought time. The plant also built places where argument could occur without harming pace. A bench could host a 5-minute negotiation about whether a step belonged upstream or down without throwing the board into panic. When the talk grew longer, it decamped to a table at the edge of the aisle and returned only when the idea had learned its manners. A permanent council would have ossified. A permanent improvisation would have frayed nerves. The compromise was a cadence of short, frequent, pragmatic conversations, each accountable to the clock and to the body that had to carry the decision out. There were errors. A batch of parts was granted a tolerance that looked generous on paper and turned proud men into repairmen for a week. A schedule was drawn with a bravery that left no place for fatigue to sit down. By Thursday it had begun to tell lies. The correction to these mistakes did not waste time searching for guilty souls. It searched for guilty ideas. The guilty idea was retired with a generosity that kept its author whole and its consequences remembered. In a room like this, the only unforgivable sin is insisting on being right after the floor has proven you wrong. What emerged, after months of such traffic, was a style of governance that rarely announced itself. It was visible in the distance between problem and permission, a short path measured not in yards but in glances and nods. It was audible in the way people spoke to one another when a fix was proposed. Show me, try it, measure it, keep it if it behaves. The alchemy of many institutions and many egos turned into something surprisingly close to humility. Decisions were built to be revised. Authority lived not in posture but in results, presented without fanfare to a room that knew exactly what to do with them. The miracle was not that the plant had no bosses. It had many, some appointed by title and some appointed by competence. The miracle was that it had trained them all to love the same outcome more than their own reflection. The outcome was not abstract. It rolled on wheels toward a door that opened onto weather. When that door swung and a crew outside looked up from their ladders and towels and nodded in satisfaction at what arrived, the decision-makers inside had their confirmation. They had governed well because the hour had kept its promise, and the machine had left without a secret. On a winter afternoon, with a pale sun diluting the skylights and the metal smelling faintly of warmed dust, a man who had not slept well traced again the route he had walked on his first visit. He did not want to be fooled by familiarity. Wonder can become a habit, and habits can decorate illusions. He carried the same notebook and the same reluctance to be impressed. The floor answered him with the same language it had used before, a grammar of movement and pause that cannot flatter, and so can only tell the truth. He paused where the catwalk bends and leaned on the railing, feeling in his ribs the braided noises that a person begins to hear as one word. The barrel sections had the same shy dignity as they moved on their rollers. The crews below had the same concentration that reads, from a distance, like silence. He caught the moment when a team leader touched a part not because he needed to, but because the touch told a newcomer where the weight was hiding. He counted without looking at his watch, the way a musician counts a bar they have played for months, and the interval matched the memory of the first afternoon. The clock had not been bullied into compliance by a visit. It had been adopted by the room as a pet it cherished. He followed the path beneath the mezzanine and stopped beside a bench where a man was teaching a motion so small it would have bored a storyteller. The man adjusted a thumb and said, softly, "There it is." The student nodded as if he had been given a secret. The visitor knew now that it was not a secret at all. It was the kind of truth you can share with anyone because it becomes more effective as it spreads. He wrote nothing. He did not want to cheapen the exchange by turning it into a flourish on paper. He wanted to remember the exact tone of the teacher's voice when he said, "There it is," because in that tone the building confessed its method. Nothing loud, everything exact. At the end of the long aisle he caught a familiar sight, a tail lifting from the haze, more suggestion than object. It did not startle him this time. It satisfied him. Satisfaction is rarer than surprise and, properly tended, more dangerous. He imagined again the message he would send, and he understood that the message had to be careful. Too much marvel and the recipients would accuse him of swallowing propaganda. Too little, and they would shrug and move on, and he needed them to stop and take this seriously. He needed them to understand that he had not been converted by showmanship, but educated by arithmetic. He walked past inspection on purpose, forcing himself to look at the place where bravery can dissolve into embarrassment. The inspectors were not theatrical. They worked like librarians, checking in books returned from a long voyage, flipping through pages that had seen weather and hands, pausing where a corner had curled. When they found something that would have hurt the day if allowed to stand, they did not hoard it. They carried the evidence to the bench where it would matter and spoke without drama. He recognized this, too, as a kind of courage. It takes nerve to tell the truth quietly. Out on the apron, a crew fussed around a machine that had just woken up. The air tasted like fuel and cold. There was laughter, the black coffee kind that is not frivolous but a seal of agreement. A mechanic tightened something invisible under a panel with the tiny satisfaction of a man who knows his part of the symphony is measured in half notes. The visitor watched as the machine surrendered itself to a crawl, then to a faster roll, then to a turn toward the place where it would learn to leave the earth. He had once thought that this was the moment the building lived for. Now he understood that the building lived for the moment before, when the last station handed the day to the door, and the room exhaled because the hour had done exactly what it had promised. He wrote at last, not quickly, and not many words. He wrote that time here had been taught to carry weight, that people had learned to lend their attention to one another at the precise points where attention multiplies, that the claims carved in chalk were redeemed not by speeches but by sequences. He wrote that this was not a single trick or a cruel discipline that bled workers dry, but a habit of arranging tasks so that flesh and metal both felt respected. He wrote that the pace frightened him less than the consistency, because consistency is how strength becomes strategy. He closed the notebook and kept his hand on it a moment, as if to steady the message before it began its journey. At the gate he met a woman leaving in a scarf patterned with dots and a grin that did not apologize for itself. She moved with the tired grace of someone whose day had made sense. He stepped aside, and she passed with the smell of the floor in her hair, the kind that lingers through supper and into sleep. He tried to imagine an answer to this that did not involve learning to do the same at home. He could not. He understood then that the most dangerous thing about this place was not its totals. It was the way it taught ordinary people to expect their hours to obey them. Evening pooled across the parking lots and the buses sighed and the windows warmed from within. In some distant room a clerk penciled an allocation, and in another a buyer signed a promise, and in still another a foreman drew a little map of a new bin layout that would make a stubborn motion less proud. The visitor stood in the wind and felt absurdly protective of a building that did not belong to him. He did not wish for it to slow. He wished for the intelligence inside it to leak into everything, into offices and kitchens and fields, and the small rooms where decisions that look private become public. He thought, not for the first time, of how wars are often narrated as duels between machines that fire and machines that dodge. He now believed that the duel is settled sooner, in places like this, where minutes consent to be organized. He looked back one last time. The catwalk held its bend like a memory. The boards still bore fresh chalk. Somewhere a first piece had just been signed by hands that would never meet the crew who would trust it at altitude. He did not pray, because he had learned that prayer has no cycle time. He simply nodded, as if the building could see him, and allowed himself the smallest smile at the thought that what he had witnessed could be made, rather than merely admired. Then he turned his collar up, tucked the notebook under his arm, and carried the message out into the cold.